art movement is a tendency or artistic style that interests and influences a number of artists at the same time. Art movements are usually popular for a certain period of time and often overlap. Art movements are particularly important in modern art. Three phases of Expressionism. Art has always had a purpose, whether to record an event, educate the illiterate, elevate our vanities, or produce beauty. Art is one of the most human of endeavors. It can help us connect with the supernatural, tell stories, document history, illustrate an artistic theory, or challenge the status quo. Although all art expresses something, when art critics or historians talk about expression in art, they are usually referring to art which attempts to evoke some subjective spiritual or emotional sensations rather than represent physical reality. There were several time periods in the 20th century when this subjective mode of expression was prominent among the art being made by many artists. The styles that emerged during these periods would be classified by art historians as expressionism. One characteristic of the modern mind is the search for new and expanded understanding. In science, this means building on old knowledge with new discoveries. In art, it means finding new ways of interpreting an ever-changing world. In the search for these new ways, young artists often rebel against the styles or parameters of art made by previous generations. Towards the latter part of the 19th century, artists in Europe began to defy the traditional and accepted style of art prevalent at the time. They began to develop new attitudes and approaches to art making that incorporated images that were making their way to Europe from different cultures. Elements such as unnatural color, flat spaces, or purposefully unrefined drawing styles began creeping into the artwork. Germany was a country where these new artistic concerns were being explored. In 1905, inspired by this new direction in art, several artists living in Dresden, Germany, formed a group called Der Bruch, the Bridge. A few years later, in Munich, another group of artists, rallying support of artist Vasily Kandinsky, whose painting had been rejected by an art exhibition, formed a similar group. They named themselves Der Blaue Reiter, after the rejected painting. Both groups explored how painting could communicate a pure, direct expression of their subjective experiences of the world. Although the term expressionism to describe the work of these artists was not established until 1913, these German artists would influence other forms of expression in both Europe and America. Their influence remained strong until the 1930s, when many of these artists would have their work condemned as degenerate art by the Nazis in the time leading up to World War II. Events in Europe, especially World War I, led some other artists away from Expressionism and into other artistic matters. Two main art movements, Dada and Surrealism, would displace German Expressionism's influence among a younger generation of artists between the start of the First World War and the end of the Second one. By the late 1940s, artists in America would take the ideas about spontaneity in art making put forth by the Surrealists and combine it with theories about purely non-objective art to form what would become the first American art movement to achieve international influence. This art movement was driven primarily by artists in New York City and would be dubbed Abstract Expressionism by art critic Robert Coates. While no clear style was dominant among these artists, their artistic approaches generally placed the artists into one of two groups. One group was called the Action Painters by critic Harold Rosenberg, because their energetic and spontaneous application of paint made it possible to follow the remnants of the action of the artist while making the painting. Another group whose main concern was expressing emotion through thin layers of color would become known as the Color Field Painters. These two groups, together nicknamed AB-X, were concerned with expressing universal human experience. This emphasis on abstraction would dominate art until about the 1960s. Once again, artistic interest shifted. Feeling that the abstract expressionists were too serious and self-absorbed, the younger artists rebelled. Several new art movements, pop, minimalism, op art, and photorealism would take the place of abstraction as the dominant artistic concerns of the 1960s and 70s. These styles would disregard individual expression and use techniques and approaches that gave the art a slick, impersonal look. But as they say, the only constant is change. By the 1980s, if you wanted to make a splash as an artist, you had to do something radical to get noticed. Just as the pop and minimalist artists had reacted against the hyper-seriousness of the abstract expressionists, yet another generation of young artists reacted against the coldness of those pop and minimal artworks. These artists looked back to what the German expressionists had done and revitalized that style with an 80s perspective. Again, Germany would be the epicenter of this new expressionism, but it was quickly taken up by artists elsewhere as well. Some art critics championed this return to both individual expression and painting after the years of art dominated by minimalist sculpture. Other critics, however, saw this neo-expressionism as a cynical attention grab, with nothing original to add over the previous versions. Nevertheless, these artists emerged at the right time in an art market that was ready for something new. Alas, their influence would become victim to the very need for splash making that gave rise to this short-lived movement. As was said at the beginning of this video, many art movements overlap. It is important to remember that many artists are working on different ideas all the time. Art history is complicated and nuanced. These versions of expressionism were three versions that were popular, but expression in art takes many forms. Regardless, we can say that the subjectivity behind expressionism with a capital E has been a major force in art.